what I'm working on now seems to me to be sort of a fairly drastic reorientation of how we think about modern, specifically postural yoga, right? So yoga asana, where it comes from, and kind of as a result of that, what does and what doesn't count as authentic, and why. So what I decided to do, is to hopefully stay to the sort of lower end of the limit of my time, and basically take you through my thinking, kind of how I got from point A to point B over the last, 3 years or so. And then hopefully we can spend some time thinking together about where we go from here. Because it's actually fairly rare that I'm in a room where there's sort of a critical mass of knowledge about yoga and yoga studies. So I'm hoping this can be really useful for all of us, including me, since I'm working on revising this manuscript right now that I've been working on. So when I wrote my book about Yogananda, that Chris so kindly mentioned, I was operating with assumptions that I think are now kind of more or less standard in yoga studies, certainly in modern yoga studies. So what is this? Modern postural yoga is really fairly modern, right? As Mark Singleton argued in Yoga Body, for instance, it's the result of this kind of complex transnational synthesis that took place over, maybe the last 150 years or so, right around the turn of the century. So in this sense, it has some commonalities with pre-modern South Asian yoga practice, but it also has some pretty important differences. And so Yogananda was a really good case study for me when I was thinking about this, because he kind of checked all of these boxes. He definitely was not a self-taught yogi by any stretch of the imagination, right? So he's based not only in this monastic tradition, but also in a lineage of practice, Kriya yoga, right? Which he was initiated into from a fairly young age. So on the one hand, he's got this very traditional background. On the other hand, he was also very much an innovator. And so from that perspective, you kind of think about the fact that he really did want to spread his practice transnationally. This is very much something that he intended to do, that he was thinking about. And he ended up being really, really good at reading and responding to what his American audiences wanted, both from him as a sort of personification, right, of the figure of the Indian yogi and all of the mystery and all of the miracles and stuff that came with that. But also from the perspective of these practices that Americans just deeply wanted to learn, right? They give us stuff to do. And so that's point A, right? Here's this transnational yogi very explicitly responding to modernity, right, and adapting his yoga practice to that. Now, this was really cool, but it didn't really answer all of my questions. So to put this into context, maybe biographically a little bit, I walked into my first Bikram yoga class maybe some 15 years ago now. And then when I finally did my teacher training, I studied with Jimmy Barkin, who was one of Bikram's first students when he came to the US in the late 70s, early 80s. And what was interesting about Jimmy was that not only was he a student of Bikram, but he was also a devotee of Paramahansa Yogananda. And so he had sort of in a very interesting way kind of resynthesized all of this stuff that had kind of fallen apart over the last 100 years or so. But the kind of yoga that I learned from Jimmy was very different than the kind of yoga that I ended up practicing when I then subsequently moved to California and I started going to these sort of, kind of corporate, non-lineage affiliated studios. And so, I think to a certain extent, this would have been very much the same had I started in another lineage, like a Iyengar or Ashtanga or something like that, right? There's nothing necessarily specific to Bikram about this story. And so, what I became interested in was what's up with this yoga that doesn't seem to be concerned with anything Indian. Where is it coming from? And to answer those questions was what brought me to kind of point B, right, which is what I'll be talking about today. And so the basic point that I've arrived at is that there's another kind of practice out there that we usually call yoga, right, when we find it out there in the wild. But that is only slightly genealogically related to stuff that we would have called yoga in India some 100, 150 years ago. In fact, had people like Yogananda not done what they did 100 years ago, we might be calling this practice something else entirely. But the thing is, we'd still be doing it, which is what's really interesting to me. Maybe like Genevieve Stebbins here, we'd be calling it psychosomatic or psychophysical culture or harmonic gymnastics or something like that, right? I mean, they're kind of clumsy terms, but maybe in the last 100 years we would have come up with something catchier. I don't know. So I'm not necessarily trying to argue that like everything that happens in core power yoga is like profoundly deep and significant, right, and like revelatory. But at the same time, what I'm trying to kind of figure out is, what do we do with this other kind of yoga? And how do we talk about it? And is the only solution really to just kind of call it bastardization of Indian practices or something like that? The kind of yoga I'm talking about is specifically the yoga that often looks asana, right, or posture, to use maybe an English language term here, which is more appropriate perhaps, that might be concerned with breathing, but not in the sort of highly systematized way that you will find when you look at actual pranayama practices. And what I've arrived at is to say that actually these are real things that have a history, that have depth to them. It's just that that history isn't South Asian. It comes from somewhere else. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And if we keep looking at, you know, the Yoga Sutras or the Hatha Yoga Pradipika or whatever to try to rationalize these practices, we're not going to find that depth. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at these other texts, right? There's all sorts of valuable stuff, different valuable stuff to be discovered there. But what I've been trying to kind of play with is how do we actually acknowledge both sides, both perspectives? And then maybe compare, right, and do our own synthesis in a way that makes sense to us. And lend validity to maybe a wider range of practice, ultimately. So, if we want to understand this synthesis, right, not only do we have to kind of consider both sides, but we have to, even before we do that, I think trace out what this other side to yoga, to modern yoga specifically, is. And so that's kind of what I'm going to at least pitch to you today. And so to that end, let's start with Yogananda, because that's where I started 3 or 4 years ago now. So hopefully this will, yep, there it goes. Okay, so when I first started thinking about Yogananda, actually the first thing that I had to deal with was the misconception that he did not teach asana, which is patently false, as you can see right here. This is from, you know, the kind of SRF-approved Yogananda movie. This is from Awake. So then what I had to figure out was, one, why don't we know that Yogananda taught asana? I still don't really have a very good answer to this. My best guess is that actually he did teach it in a sort of fairly limited way. He really only taught it to his close male disciples. And so then two, what on a practical level did Yogananda teach? Not just to his close circle of disciples, but to the large audiences that he attracted. And so what I found when I started looking for this was Yogoda, which he calls the tissue will system of physical perfection. And now I was really confused, because not only did this stuff not look like asana, right, yoga, from the outside, but I really couldn't figure out what his sources for this stuff were. And so I kind of puddled around for a while trying to figure out, where is he even getting this? And so Mark Singleton had actually kind of tried to trace out some of this stuff a bit, but when I looked at the text that he was pointing to, which is this sort of standard New Thought stuff about training the will and affirmations and things like that, they actually didn't have a whole lot in common with the exercises, the specific exercises that Yogananda was prescribing to his students in Yogoda. So digging through the accounts of Yogananda's associates then, I found that he had come across a physical culture manual, as his friend says, by a German physical culturalist named Miller. And so then I started looking for this Miller. Now I couldn't find a Miller, but who I found was the Danish physical culturalist named Jørgen Müller, who just happened to have written one of the most popular physical culture manuals of the early 20th century. And so this was kind of helpful, not only because Müller's exercise look a whole lot like Yogananda's, but he also talks about some of this sort of yoga-sounding stuff, like pairing movement with breath, for instance. Although notably, right, the kinds of exercises that you find here wouldn't really read as yoga to us today. I mean, it's exactly this kind of stuff. There's a lot of like rotating the torso and like swinging the arms and things like that. Now, there are two things that Müller's book doesn't really explain for us. One is he doesn't really talk about this sort of very intentional kind of flexing and releasing of the muscles that Yogananda really likes. So they both do the swinging, right? But Yogananda's like a little bit more methodical about it. And two, there's really nothing spiritual or metaphysical about his system, really whatsoever. And so at the time I kind of figured, like, all right, probably Yogananda read more than one book in his life. And so he got some of this stuff from somewhere else, and I sort of figured that a lot of the spiritual stuff, and specifically the sort of way that he was imagining energy in the system, probably came from his background in Kriya Yoga, which deals with all of this in great depth, right? So he clearly had something to draw on there. And so I was like sort of satisfied. And then I started seeing a lot of really interesting stuff coming out of historical dance studies about how early modern dancers had appropriated yoga. Here you see Genevieve, or not Genevieve, Ruth St. Denis, for instance. So I thought, okay, interesting, right? Where are they learning this stuff? So this image of Ruth St. Denis was actually taken right here in LA. This is at her Denishan school. Oops, I don't know what happened there. Let's go back to Ruth St. Denis. And she explicitly said, right, she's teaching her first yoga class when she does this. This is happening around 1915 or so. Now, certainly there were already Indian yogis in the US that were teaching something that looked very much like yoga asana, although not entirely what she's doing here. And Ruth St. Denis was a performer, so it wouldn't have been terribly shocking if she had crossed paths with these yogis at some point. What was interesting to me, though, was that she was doing a lot of this sort of circular rotating stuff that I'd seen Yogananda teaching, but which hadn't really been identified with yoga anywhere else. And so this shouldn't be happening, according to my timeline, until at least maybe 10 years later or so. And so then I began thinking, well, gosh, maybe Yogananda was not the first person to do this. And around this time, I was kind of in between projects, and so I was wrapping up this article on yogis and an alternative medicine that I was working on, for which I'd been reading a lot of literature on this sort of turn-of-the-century American mind cure and New Thought and a lot of stuff like that. And so I began noticing that some of these historians that were working on this stuff would reference certain American authors who they claimed were teaching things like yoga breathing, for instance. Now, this was all going on in the second half of the 20th century. But it also went back to much earlier, the second half of the 19th century. So it went back much earlier than times that we would expect to see things like yoga breathing, right? So this is before Vivekananda, for instance. And so it didn't seem impossible to me that there was some actual sort of contact with yogic teachings, but it was a little bit surprising. And so I figured, okay, let's figure out where these folks might be getting yoga breathing in the 1870s. Let's read their actual texts. Maybe they tell us where they figured out or where they learned yoga breathing. So usually these references are about this one guy, Walter Felt Evans. As early as 1869, Evans was talking about breath and spirit, the effect of breath on the mind, on health, things that sound a whole lot like yoga to us. But here's the thing, not once in this book does he ever mention yoga, yogis, anything Indian or even Oriental, which is the term that he would have more likely used. Now, he does get really excited about Indian metaphysics a little bit later down the road, once he reads some of the stuff that the Theosophists are putting out about it. But this isn't really until the late 1980s or 1880s or so, and even then, like, he's talking about this stuff with ether, right, and all this sort of very abstract metaphysical stuff, but he doesn't ever connect it to all these things that he's talking about with regards to breath and movement and the stuff that sounds like physical yoga to our modern sensibilities. So now I was really, really confused. And then I had my sort of epiphany moment. When Vivekananda appears in the US, he says some really interesting things about what he is and is not teaching. Now, to say that he didn't teach physical yoga is actually like a little bit wrong. Breath work, pranayama, right, is sort of by definition a physical practice. To breathe is very much physical. And so when I looked at what Vivekananda says about the body, right, about this sort of physical yoga that he actually terms hatha yoga, I found something really interesting. So actually, we'll come to this quote up here in a second. Oh gosh, it keeps skipping. I think it's probably because I copy and pasted some of these slides from a show where I had a timer. Anyway, it should stay put now. So when he first introduces the topic of hatha yoga, he says the following, right, and it's very much oriented towards health. He says, quote, "The first obstruction is an unhealthy body. If the body is not in a fit state, the practice will be obstructed. Therefore, we have to keep the body in good health. We have to take care of what we eat and drink and what we do. Always use a mental effort, what is usually called Christian science, to keep the body strong. That is all. Nothing further on the body. We must not forget that health is only a means to an end. If health were the end, we would be like animals. Animals rarely become unhealthy." Now, this is also kind of patently false, but whatever. And so then a little bit further down the line, he starts talking specifically about stuff that sort of sounds like it's referencing asana, right, posture. And so he kind of similarly doubles down, right? We have nothing to do with it here because its practices are very difficult, which he clearly thought, and cannot be learned in a day. After all, do not lead to much spiritual growth. Many of these practices you will find in Delsart and other teachers, such as placing the body in different postures. The object of these is physical, not psychological. Now, by psychological, he really means spiritual, right? It's kind of a particularity of his late 19th century phrasing. And this is where something clicked for me. Now, when he says Delsart, he's actually probably not referring to Francois Delsart himself, who we will meet in a second, who's an actual person. He's almost certainly referencing something that was called American Delsartism, which by the 1890s had become sort of like the first fitness brand, essentially. Now here's where things get really interesting, because these American dancers who are supposedly appropriating yoga, and oh gosh, it's going to keep doing this, huh? They're all trained in Delsart. And actually, if you look at what people like Ruth St. Denis on the one hand are doing with breath and movement, which often gets attributed to influence from yoga because of how she uses Oriental aesthetics, right? So this is her performing Radha, for instance. Well, we can find the same exact thing in other dancers like Isadora Duncan, who claim that they're getting it from somewhere else entirely. She says this is ancient Greek temple dance. And so, what do these two ladies have in common? What they have in common is this system of Delsart. And specifically, Delsart as taught by Genevieve Stebbins. This is actually not an image from Stebbins' book. It's one of her colleagues and contemporaries. And the inside cover that you see here is from a later publication of hers. But as you might spot in the little author blurb here, her early work was on this Delsart system of gymnastics. Now, for Stebbins, this is physical culture, but it's also very explicitly spiritual. In fact, even in her earlier work, So if we go back to this image here, this is 1893 that this book comes out, where she's talking about psychical, aesthetic, and physical culture. This is the same year as Vivekananda arrives in the US, but she wrote this clearly in a time that would have sort of preceded any influence that he might have had. This quote here is actually from an even earlier work. This comes out in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And so what she's doing when she's building on this background that she has in Delsarte, which I'll talk about in a second, is she's ultimately elaborating on these concepts that we're sort of much more used to seeing in, I might need to actually just sort of...
Do you want me to just stand here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe flip it back when it just sort of does the thing on its own. So we'll stay here for now. She's elaborating on these concepts that are a lot more familiar to us from Asian sources. Here she's talking about a spiritual body. She's talking about this sort of flow of energy. In fact, she's talking about the channels through which this energy flows and how we might sort of facilitate the flow by clearing these channels, right, and letting the energy through. Now for her, right, this is all very much connected to what the physical body is doing. Remember, this is psychophysical culture. And so what she's actually sort of trying to get at is the way in which the soul, in a sort of very Western, for her, partially Christian sense, is able to speak through the body and how we facilitate that process. In order for the body to perfectly express the soul, you have to train it. So literally, you have to do like gymnastics and stuff. And so what she does in her later work, where she does depart a little bit from this sort of Delsarte party line, which would have been more or less kind of common in the physical culture, specifically as it was prescribed for women in the late 19th century. She comes up with her own system of exercises, and she calls these energizing exercises. Now, cool. Oh, yep, there we are. Stebbins isn't being wholly original here, right? She actually admits this. In fact, she tells us exactly where her energizing exercises come from, and so she gives us these three sources. One, the so-called aesthetic gymnastics of Delsarte's training. Two, the Swedish or Ling system. And three, the ceremonial forms of Oriental prayer. Now, don't get bogged down by the Oriental stuff here. Stebbins has almost zero familiarity with any kind of Asian movement practice. If she knows anything, she kind of has some sense that, like, again, dance is a thing. She talks about Indian temple dance, which she very quickly compares to ancient Greek temple dance. And it's very clear that she's only using kind of secondhand missionary accounts. Like, she's never seen this happen. What she means here by Oriental, if you look at her, the exercises that she actually prescribes, is maybe partially kind of inspired by like Indian stuff, but actually more frequently she refers to the Middle East, to Egypt, right? The Orient is a sort of very big, vague place in her day and time. So actually, bracket the Oriental source, right? It's a little bit of a red herring. It actually doesn't give us anything very substantive about what Stebbins is doing. It's there to give a sort of universalist legitimacy to the other two sources. So that's what I want to talk just a teeny tiny bit about. And let's talk about Ling first. Now, Per Ling, who lived and taught in Sweden in the early 19th century, unfortunately didn't actually publish any of his system. This is the one book that he began and ultimately his students had to finish after he died. But his system was also hugely popular and influential, especially in its military and medical forms. He also taught two other types of gymnastics, which he called pedagogic, so think kind of like gym class, basically, right? This is what we teach children. And then aesthetic gymnastics. Now, generally, this is what we would call kind of secular gymnastics, meaning it doesn't have a sort of explicitly religious or even spiritual goal to it as such. But it's barely the 19th century, so I mean, kind of almost everything is still like a little bit metaphysical, right? So here's how Ling's different divisions of gymnastics are described. Right. One, there's pedagogic gymnastics, through which one learns to bring his body under his own will, developing unity among the parts of the organism. Two, there's military gymnastics, through which one seeks to subject the will of another person to his own will by means of one's bodily power, with or without the aid of a weapon. Three, there's medical gymnastics, through which one seeks either through his own effort or with the help of another person, so think like physical therapy, to restore unity between the parts of his own body. And four, there's aesthetic gymnastics, through which one seeks to express the unity of one's mental and bodily being. Now, it's this last category that's sort of the most explicitly spiritual, and also the one of which we have the least written elaboration from Ling. He does say, though, in this book, for example, that while in pedagogic gymnastics, it's the body that acts on the soul, in aesthetic gymnastics, it's the soul that acts on the body, right? So there's definitely kind of a physical, spiritual back and forth going on here. And aesthetic gymnastics ultimately are very much about using the body to express the soul. And we'll come back to why this is kind of important. So Ling's system becomes very popular in the US by the second half of the 19th century. And you see exercises, like, for instance, some of the ones that you see pictured here, which kind of wouldn't look out of place in a modern yoga class. And these are being taught all over the place, including in schools. Certain forms of Ling gymnastics are especially popular among women because they're believed to be sort of fairly light and unstrenuous. So here's a completely kind of non-spiritualized version of Ling gymnastics by a lady doctor named Mary Bissell. In fact, these images come directly from her book. And so for her, this is just sort of about, right, restoring to women bodily health, which for them in the late 19th century would have been sort of very much on the decline due to what both doctors and, interestingly, feminists at the time describe as the sort of oppressive norms of women's dress, for instance. And so this is actually sort of somewhat revolutionary because on the one hand, you have all of these anti-women's rights advocates that are basically arguing against women doing everything from, you know, reading novels to exercising to going to college on the basis of their very limited physical power, right? So if you like read a book, your entire reproductive system will basically self-destruct. Off you go. And so in a climate like this, it's actually sort of fairly radical to be talking about women using their bodies to, as we'll see in a second, sort of draw on the power of this sort of infinite reservoir of energy that ultimately has a sort of cosmic connotations. Now, the other big concern for women's fitness around this time is that not only does it have to be sort of light enough for women to participate in, because even the feminists are like, okay, well, like, we can't give them too much, but it also has to be aesthetically pleasing. I mean, you literally find teachers saying that if women's exercises are not appropriately graceful and appropriately attractive, women just won't do them, right? So it's kind of a doomed project to begin with. And so here's where this idea of aesthetic gymnastics becomes important. Now, Ling already had this division in his original kind of four-part system. But as things start to sort of happen in the late 19th century, so here we're talking really 1880s, early 1890s, there's another name that becomes even more associated with this idea, and that name is Delsarte. Now, Delsarte was actually a composer. He never taught gymnastics exactly, but he did teach ways of moving the body that artists, so for instance, actors, orators, might use to kind of systematically express certain emotions. So here, we could kind of go down the rabbit hole of understanding where this idea of aesthetics gets tied to not only kind of bodily exercise, right, but also the sort of more spiritual ends of the body being used to express the soul. This stuff goes way, way back. As one American teacher, Louis Monroe, who was very into Delsartism, put, Delsarte is Swedenborg geometrized, for instance. Now, to my knowledge, Swedenborg, who was this sort of very famous Swedish mystic, and Delsarte don't have any actual direct connection. But what Monroe here is likely picking up on, and what Delsarte and Swedenborg and even Ling all have in common, is that they are drawing on a very old European, and before that Hellenic, tradition of thinking about the body, the spirit, and the soul. And here we get into all sorts of stuff that we really are much more used to seeing in the context of Asian sources. Subtle bodies being perhaps one of the most important things. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that modern dancers who pick up on Delsarte and Ling and use it to promote physical culture are drawing on. So here, for instance, is Isadora Duncan, right? She's the one that likes talking about Greek temple dance, describing her practice. I spent long days and nights in the studio seeking that dance, which might be the divine expression of human spirit through the medium of the body's movement. For hours, I would stand quite still with my two hands folded between my breasts, covering the solar plexus. My mother often became alarmed to see me remain for such long intervals quite motionless, as if in a trance. But I was seeking and finally discovered the central spring of all movement, the crater of motor power, the unity from which all diversities of movement are born, the mirror of vision for the creation of the dance. Now to us, it might sound a whole lot like she's talking about the heart chakra or something. Notice the stuff that's going on here with the solar plexus, right? Holding her hands folded between her breasts. But she's not. She's never heard of chakras, as far as I can tell. So what is she talking about? Well, what she's talking about is something a little bit more like this. This is actually a diagram of the subtle body from an early 17th century medical textbook. What you're seeing here is actually the solar system as it's correlated to the human body. These are the celestial spheres, which are actually sort of arranged according to the same proportions as the human body, but also the diatonic octave, right? So think music. The idea being that the human body and the whole universe function like a sort of musical instrument. Health is perfect harmony. Now notice where the sphere of the sun here is correlated with the heart. This is also the center of the animal spirits, or the soul. This is the stuff that literally gives us life, right? Like the heat of the sun leads to things sort of sprouting up, right? Our heart is seemingly where sort of our lifeblood, right, and all that stuff kind of pumps out. So this is why folks like Duncan and Stebbins and quite a few others at this time are obsessed with the solar plexus. In fact, it's why the solar plexus is called the solar plexus. As we get out of the Renaissance, so this is still kind of late Renaissance, right, into the Enlightenment, this framework becomes tricky because, one, we no longer think the Earth is at the center of the solar system, right, we've kind of gotten past that. And two, we no longer think that the body is connected to the soul by these spirits that are infused into the humors. Well, we do still kind of think that, but we're using different language for it. By the time of Newton, spirit becomes electricity. And so we're no longer locating it in the blood pumping through the heart, we're looking for it in the nerves, right? So our understanding of the human body is evolving. What's the solar plexus? It's this big cluster of nerves that's sort of right below where the heart would be, right? And so it inherits the role of the heart. So here it is a little bit closer. You can see the earthy sphere that's kind of located at the base of the torso. The celestial spheres are higher. There's the sun with the heart. And then finally, the divine sits right at the crown. So here's the subtle body. Now, back to Genevieve Stebbins then. She teaches the stuff that she calls psychophysical culture, which she tells us is the perfect unison of harmonic gymnastics and dynamic breathing during the formulation of noble ideals in the mind. Sounds a hell of a lot like yoga. But notice, right, this kind of tripartite, the idea of body, the spirit, right, which isn't quite the soul, and then the soul and the mind being sort of this interchangeable thing up there. And then she goes on, right? So what do you get by doing this? Well, it essentially kind of magnetizes, she's using 19th century scientific language there, the lungs and the brain. And so it attracts these finer, she calls them ethereal essences from the atmosphere with every breath, and stores up this essence in the lung cells and the brain convolutions in almost the same way that a storage battery stores up the electricity from the dynamo or other supply of energy. Now, we've got bodily movement, we've got breath, we've got mind all working in tandem here, but the idea is you're literally breathing in energy from the world around you, with which your body is continuous, right? So there's this sort of idea of correspondence between the human body and the outside world, and you store it up, kind of like charging a battery. So what's the goal? Psychophysical culture is the art of being able to always express the true self, to elevate the soul to its highest aspiration, and the mind to express its highest possible plane of thought. And last but not least, to concentrate the whole vital energy at a moment's notice to any portion of the body for the immediate execution of the behests of the will. It is the art of graceful dynamic presentation of the self under all possible circumstances, and an increase of life by increasing the capacity for the reception, storage, and utilization of willpower. So if we were to like boil this down, what is she really saying? Be all that you can be, right? In all sorts of senses. Physically, right? So health is definitely a consideration here. Mentally, spiritually, but also as sort of a person acting in the world. And again, think of how radical this would have been from the perspective of not just sort of spirituality and how that would have mapped onto the Christian landscape of this day, but the fact that she's a woman that's saying this. Now, here we come back to Yogananda for a second. So this is an ad for his Yogoda system. Here's your body battery again, right? In fact, in this little zoomed in part here, notice Yogananda uses a lot of the same language that Stebbins does. Now, I'm not saying that Yogananda isn't doing anything original. He is. But this isn't it. Right? This is, now I'm coming to realize, right, having published a book on it, actually fairly directly from stuff that Stebbins wrote some 30, 40 years earlier. On the surface, Yogoda is exactly what you would learn if you picked up a Genevieve Stebbins book. It's all in there. Except for one thing. Yogananda's mantra-based concentration techniques that you find at the end of the energization exercises. But here's the thing, right? The energization exercises are still taught today by the Self-Realization Fellowship, right? This is something that's in the lasting body of Yogananda's thought, but they're taught as a preamble to something else. The energization exercises are not a goal in and of themselves. They are preparation for Kriya Yoga. Right? You do that, and then you sit down and you do other stuff. So, is psychophysical culture yoga? Well, it certainly looks a lot like one kind of yoga that we do today. Historically, though, if we're looking at what Stebbins was doing, she didn't call it yoga, or even explicitly compare it to yoga. Even if Vivekananda did, right? Remember, Vivekananda says, Hatha Yoga is basically Delsart. So why doesn't he teach asana, aside from the fact that apparently he tried to learn it and decided it was too difficult? Well, because he doesn't consider it to be anything particularly unique, right? He takes a look at the landscape of what kind of alternative spiritual Americans are doing. He's like, okay, like you've got this stuff, right? Why would I teach you this? And so he teaches them something else. Genevieve Stebbins and the folks that Vivekananda encountered were doing this sort of physical stuff, right, which on the surface, if you kind of don't dig any deeper, looks like the sort of health-promoting stuff that Vivekananda thought Hatha Yoga was. But they're also doing other stuff that makes sense in their context when paired with the sort of bodily health-giving exercises that they're prescribing. And then what about Yogananda's energization exercises, right? Is that yoga? If Kriya Yoga is yoga, and you do the exercises as a sort of preliminary, right? Remember, yoga is a word to describe the practice, but also its goal. Well, then wouldn't the exercises be part of yoga? And now here's the other interesting thing. You can't get to the goal of Yogananda's yoga by only doing the energization exercises, right? Ultimately, you have to move beyond that and do the stuff that falls into Kriya practice. But Stebbins' goal is different. Right? The goal of Kriya Yoga is not the goal of psychophysical culture. The goal of psychophysical culture is to turn the body into a perfect instrument for the music of the soul. The point is to express the soul through the body. So to some extent, in this system, the physical movements are the goal. Right? Insofar as once you master this sort of way of moving the body, you're there, right? You achieve the sort of perfect unison of your three various bodily spheres. Which kind of, I think, sheds a new light on what we're doing when we foreground asana in certain kinds of modern yoga classes. But, and so this is kind of where I'm stuck now. Is that yoga? Or is it something else? Right? Should we keep calling it yoga because that's what we've been doing for about 100 years now? And what does that get us and what does that leave out of the picture? So I would love thoughts. Thank you. Okay. I don't know, what do y'all think? Yes?
Well, this is more a question, but so I've followed what you said. It's blowing my mind. So how did it come, besides Paramahansa Yogananda, how did it come to be called yoga? Because these women weren't calling it that.
So some of them do begin to call it yoga, right? If we look at, so Stebbins, right, is not calling it yoga, partially because she's developing this stuff before Vivekananda even comes onto the scene, right? She's doing sort of this other thing that for her comes out of different sources. But if you look at some of the dancers now that are training with Stebbins and kind of following this still start system, so here Ruth St. Denis is a really great example, right? She looks at this stuff and she decides, oh, this is yoga. And so then she starts calling it yoga. And other folks that are actually white dudes from like Utah, but are calling themselves Yogi Ramacharaka, start calling it yoga. And so it takes off in this sort of weird way, right? And then of course there's Indian yogis that are also calling it yoga, because they're like, okay, well, like let's capitalize on this. And so I think it takes off for a variety of reasons, one of which is just sort of this Western fascination, right, with anything Oriental. So if you call it, you know, gymnastics, like, okay, we've been doing that for a long time. There's nothing particularly special or interesting about it. But if you call it yoga, right, now it's like all sexy and new. And so it's a marketing tactic, I think, to some extent, right? And if you see the stuff that's being done under the label of just gymnastics in, let's say, the 1890s, right, and you look at the stuff that's increasingly being called yoga in like the 1920s and 30s, there's actually a lot of overlap. And none of it looks exactly like what we would see in like a modern yoga class. But the overlap happens gradually, I think, right? So there's this kind of shift that occurs over the last decade or so of the 19th century and then the first 3 or 4 decades of the 20th. That kind of makes sense. Yeah?
So you're saying potentially it's a misnomer and just stuck.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm kind of struggling with, right? Like, is it a misnomer? And I think a lot of that comes down to, like, what we want to do with yoga and what we want it to mean, and whether or not we, as, like, let's say, white American people, get to decide what it means, right? Or when people tell us, like, okay, this stuff that you're doing doesn't really seem to be, like, authentic yoga. I mean, maybe there's something to that, right? Like, I'm genuinely not sure.
But at this point, like, maybe it's out of our hands to decide whether or not these practices are yoga, because, like, wherever it all came from, it has sort of taken on its own life and spreads back to India. And now, you know, we've got International Day of Yoga, and, you know, so, like, if we go, oh, all right, you know, core power is no longer called core power yoga, it's core power
Harmonic gymnastics.
you know? Yeah, like, I don't know, it's like an interesting thing to kind of think about, like, well, how does that work? Like, does that confuse the whole world? Does it only confuse Americans? Like, you know, again, like, there's all these other people now who have taken this practice and, you reabsorbed it or like turned it into their own thing.
Well, and like, let me be honest here, right? Like on a practical, on the ground level, like, yes, like the cat's out of the bag, right? Like they're not gonna like put it all back in. Be like, okay, like now we gotta like, let's see, you're doing this, so like you get to call what you're doing yoga, but then like, oh no, you're doing this other thing, so like you have to use some other word. And plus then you have to look at Indian yogis, right? That are doing stuff that's basically just like Yogananda or Sri Yogendra or something. And say, okay, so like what you're doing isn't yoga then really, right? You're like doing this other stuff. So like you, Indian man, do not get to call your practice yoga.
Right.
So it really throws a wrench into even like this cultural appropriation debate that we seem to be having. Yeah.
If you go back to the Yoga Sutras and you look at Yoga Chittabuti Nirodha, which means yoga is the sensation of movements in the consciousness, then this is yoga, because it's just approaching it a different way. Because if, like, what it sounds like Stebbins was trying to do when she says, like, channeling the soul through the body, to me, that's flow state. And when you're in that state of flow, that is what it is. It's a cessation of movements in the consciousness. And the yoga that we might be doing here in the United States, asanas are only one part of an eightfold path of yoga, so they're only a part of it. So it's not wrong to call it yoga. It's only one part of it. And that also doesn't mean, like, so people who are practicing that and they're only practicing asanas, it's still a gateway for them. It's still a gateway for them. It's their choice where they want to take it, but even if they don't know they're doing that, they're still doing it. They're still training their mind and training their will to slow down and prepare for meditation. They may never actually do the meditation. The difference in what Yogananda specifically did is he connected it more directly to God. But not every branch of yoga does that, and I think that's kind of like what's unique to him. But so it is yoga, it's just only one part of it.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that?
Yes. Now I have some thoughts on that, but I'd love to have somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you didn't have time to talk about in here is in the biography of a yogi book that you wrote about Yogananda, that you actually, in addition, you almost went there in the presentation, but you also say that he kind of retained this Hatha Yoga system of energization, or energy, and I forget how you say it, energetics
Yeah, so
maybe?
Kriya yoga isn't Patanjali yoga, right?
Right.
It's very much Hatha yoga.
Right. It's Hatha Yoga. So, but what you're arguing in that book is that even though, they're doing these practices, Yogananda was still retaining the Indian side of it, but he wasn't calling it that. He was calling it energization, which was replacing asana for most people. But for him, it was going towards the Hatha Yoga goal. For Stebbins, it was not. She wasn't thinking that way. Perhaps,
Exactly.
yes, it will have an effect on the mind. Any mind-body practice will have an effect on the mind, and breathing will have some effect on the mind, but that wasn't her goal, because she was coming out of this Western lineage, from what I'm understanding, that wasn't concerned with stilling the mind.
Yeah.
Whereas-
Well, so for her, there's still an effect on the mind. I mean, let's actually be sort of clear about this.
Yeah.
Stilling the mind is not the goal in all pre-modern Indian yoga practice,
Right.
There are other things that you might do even with the mind. For Stebbins, so she has this like kind of cognitive mental component to it, right? Remember, it's the union of harmonic gymnastics and dynamic breathing together with this sort of, what she calls it, like the ideal states of the mind or something like that. So there's a mental and a contemplative component to this. And if you backtrack through the sort of European and even older sources, so a lot of this is kind of like Platonism and Neoplatonism is what we're really talking about. There is very much something that you're doing with the mind here, but it's not stilling it. In fact, you're focusing on very specific things depending on the effect that you want to produce, right? So you might contemplate, a stone, or, you might contemplate light, the sun or something like that, in order to cultivate a specific kind of mindfulness in yourself. And so, I mean, there's a more complex framework in which that sort of makes sense. And so the mind is still there, it's just there in a different way, and the end goal that they're imagining is different. I mean, I think even if we look at, again, pre-modern yoga systems, not everybody's going towards the same goal, right? Not everybody wants to still the mind. But here we sort of kind of get into maybe even a different can of worms. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I thought one of the things that you said was really interesting was that the practice that Genevieve was offering was like, it was a practice in and of itself. It was the expression of that thing flowing. I mean, it's sort of what it appears you described of this idea of a flow state. And that it's so interesting, and I can't help but think, like, I've been going to Soho yoga, and I leave there thinking, like, I don't feel like that was yoga.
And like I had a little kid ask me today, like, well, what, like, where did yoga come from? Like, what is it? Like, who started it? And I think you're exactly right that sort of cat's out of the bag. But it's really interesting that even now we're talking about it like, oh, I can, in a way, control my body or shift my body so that then my mind, like with the ultimate goal, like there's an understanding, like even in our modern context, that there's a sort of lessness of the body that we can sort of then deal with so that we can have that mindedness. And it would appear to me that that is an influence of Vivekananda. That he's a sort of a point or a flashlight on that sense of like, we're going to raise up the sort of philosophical or the mindedness, which I think fits very well within what I understand sort of a Western frame of thinking to be, which is you sort of prize the mind and maybe the body not so much. But there seems to be an interest, like now that we talk about it in that way, maybe not even acknowledging our senses of frame of mind that is sort of so separate from body. Can we even understand looking back at a time when body or mind was really just understood so differently? So how much is our modern lens then shifting our perspective? And it's that is the sort of interesting sort of, oh, look at that push and pull.
Yeah.
Because yoga keeps changing its name, and we even use it interchangeably. You know, when we talk about asana practice, we call it yoga, but we talk about like there's a capital Y yoga, or like a, you know, and like that can't be the ends, like can it be the ends and the mean? And does that change based on where our pointedness is in time?
Yeah, so let me just respond to that very quickly. I think the modern versus pre-modern piece here is really important, right? Because like, yes, we are thinking about these things in a radically different way. But what I also find interesting is the way that we try to set up this sort of like Western versus Eastern distinction. And so to say that, you know, in the West or something, we tend to like treat mind and body as like really separate, right? Like Christianity like hates the body. That's true in some contexts. In other contexts, so actually, Chris, when you were talking about this idea of like kind of creating the perfect like adamantine body, right, which we see in Hatha Yoga, you find that stuff in Western esotericism, for instance, right? Like, what do you think medieval alchemists are doing? They're doing exactly that. They're doing it in a different framework and according to slightly different logics. But like they actually have an oddly sort of similar goal, right? So there is this sort of fundamental distinction that I think you find both in the Western but also the Indian context of like kind of dualism versus like maybe like a monism or something, right? Like, are there two things here, right? Is there a body that we ultimately have to leave behind, and then there's like mind or spirit or soul or whatever you want to call that other thing, right? And is that separate and we have to go like up there to like reach our goal? Or is there really just the one thing? Right, and then maybe, yeah, you have something like that flow state where I think that's what Stebbins is ultimately kind of aiming towards, right? Like you sort of realize like the unity of the whole system. And now she's doing it in a way that's different from like what people in the Renaissance would have been doing, right? But I think there is sort of a common logic there. Chris?
Yeah, what do we know about Stebbins?
On what level?
Historical, biographical, education?
So she did not train with Delsart himself, but that's kind of her earliest background. I'm forgetting her exact sort of biography at this point. She's American, right? She does go to France and she trains with kind of direct students of Delsart. So that's the system in which she starts. But she's also very involved in sort of these esoteric societies of her day. So the man she ends up marrying, and she both belong to the Order of the Golden Dawn, for instance, right? And so if you look at kind of her personal, like, more philosophical contemplations, I mean, she finds, like, the Eastern stuff really fascinating, but it's clear that she has a very limited understanding of it. So she's really into light of Asia, right? But her biggest influence, I think, is really the sort of coupling of Delsart and Ling gymnastics that you find in New York around sort of last couple of decades of the 19th century.
Was she a New Yorker?
She opens a school in New York, and she spends quite a bit of time there, kind of at the height of her career. And so she's studying with these exponents of Delsart, and that's kind of who she's a representative of just by virtue of some of the work that she publishes. But she also studies at this, what's called the Institute of the Swedish Movement Cure in New York. And so some of the synthesis of the Ling stuff and the Delsart stuff happens even before her. So her teacher, Steele Mackey, does a lot of this. But she really kind of doubles down on it. And the component that she adds is this sort of, the thing that ultimately built into something like modern dance among really students of hers. So there's kind of, yeah, there's a lot of, I think, similar but also divergent strands that she's pulling from. But most of them are the sort of Western stuff.
And her fashion statement, though, is remarkable, considering it would have been corsets and laces.
Well, and that's the other interesting about her and a lot of the other women mostly, right? So there's somebody did like a historical study of just Delsarte, whose name I'm forgetting now. She's a dance historian, Nancy Reuter, I think is her name. Anyway, so she actually looked at, who's teaching Delsarte, and it's what you find in the yoga world today. It's something like 80% women. There are male Delsarte teachers, but it's very much targeted towards women, and so it's plugged into some of these concerns with dress reform, for instance, right? So there's a reason that she's got this sort of toga thing going on. And it's interesting because it's also bringing in, right, like why is it like a sort of flowing Grecian robe? There's like a neoclassicism going on here. And so for her, that's why she's concerned with Greek temple dance, right? Because she very much sees herself as reviving this kind of classical tradition, right? So yes, like now the sort of Greek statue of the male body is the ideal for that. But like the Greeks made female nudes too, right? And they don't look like these like teeny tiny corseted waists that we have going on in the 19th century. And so women like Stebbins really latch onto that, right? So when you do psychophysical culture, you do it in this kind of getup.
The yoga pants that are...
Yeah, right?
Is there, two questions. Is there any evidence that Yogananda ever knew of or even heard of Stebbins or Delsarte? And the other question is, there's certain features of his energization exercises that they make a big point of. He did and his current disciples do. And I'm curious if those were part of Stebbins, and I'm thinking especially of his emphasis on what he called will, the willpower affecting physical movements, and the tensing and releasing part of the energization exercises, and the connection of the medulla as the sort of entry, what he called the entry point of prana, and its importance in the whole thing. Is any of that in?
So the first two, yes. In fact, that's what's distinctive about what Stebbins is teaching as opposed to some of the other physical culture manuals of her time that like I had kind of originally identified Yogananda as drawing on, right? Like this, the tensing and releasing. I mean, it's very typical of Delsarte physical culture in general.
And is there any evidence that those things were known in India? Because he developed these before he came here.
Yeah, so that's where, and I can't find Yogananda referencing Stebbins anywhere.
No, I didn't either.
But Yogendra does. Yogendra quotes Stebbins directly, and he mentions her by name. And he's writing this sort of at around the same time, so we're talking like late 19-teens, as Yogananda would have. Now, Yogendra went to America, right? And so like when he writes his books, he's referencing actually a lot of the people that he hung out with when he was in the U.S. So I don't know whether he would have encountered Stebbins' book while he was in the U.S. or whether it had made its way over to India. I haven't looked into that yet. But I'm thinking that it's not unrealistic. And plus, when we see Yogoda publications, right, I mean, like some of the first pamphlets are coming out, 24, 25.
Yeah.
So this is once Yogananda's been in the U.S. for a while, right? Yeah. Even if he had access to sort of other things.
But the energization exercises he started.
But we don't know what they looked like back then.
That's true, but that's what he called them.
Right.
But there were European, Brits and German writers who were very well known in his Calcutta, who may in turn have...
Well, right, and so Mueller actually does quite a bit of this too. I'm convinced he's actually getting it from Stebbins because what she's doing is so distinctive, and it's not found in any of these other manuals. Now, the last thing that you bring up, which is this idea of the medulla, right, being the entry point of prana, that's not in Stebbins.
No.
You know what is? The solar plexus.
Oh.
The solar plexus is where ether, right, and spirit enter into the body according to the Western system. And so there's these sort of interesting differences, right? Like when they're talking about the subtle body, parts of it sound quite a bit like chakra talk right now. Of course, at this point, the chakras are also going through this sort of major transformation at the hands of the Theosophists. But this obsession with kind of lifting the chest, right, is very, very prominent in the Western style of physical culture. And then if you think about like, okay, well, what would this look like, right? In yoga, you want to straighten the spine, right, to facilitate the kind of the flow of the Kundalini energy. Well, lifting the chest to kind of foreground the solar plexus, right, so that you kind of get this influx of spirit here, and lengthening the spine to facilitate the flow of Kundalini are metaphysically different things. But if you were to practice this, like what would it look like, right? You can't straighten the spine without lifting the chest, and vice versa. So if you kind of think about it from the standpoint of like literally what is the body doing, right? It's interesting how they converge. That's something that occurred to me as I was like contemplating, to what extent can we even read what a body is doing from the outside, right? And to what extent is it how you're thinking about what the body is doing, right? Like why are you doing this thing? Are you lifting the chest or are you straightening the spine? Chris?
One of the other things that you talk about in your new book, you use the metaphor of an osculation, right? And I really like that. And it seems like that there's something that's happening in the cultural translation here that you're describing, as you're describing right now, that makes this all possible because it's where these overlaps are, that the yoga, things become yoga and yoga becomes other things because there's a translation taking place between different cultures. And they're translating what it is that they can understand, but it's not necessarily, it depends who you look at, but it's not necessarily something new emerges out of that, right? Out of that translation.
Yeah.
So it's not the one thing, it's not the other, it's the two things coming together. Anyway, it was more of a comment, but I think that the metaphor is useful. I don't think you brought it up here, but
No, I didn't.
you use it in the book, but I just think it's really helpful for understanding like what's actually happening here. As you say, is like there's these two strands of thought and bodily practice that meet, and from those things, I think that's how you describe it, something new grows.
Yeah, well, and I know that you kind of like latched onto this, right? Like in this new project, I'm being almost purposefully kind of like hyperbolic in terms of really doubling down on the Western sources. Like, look at all this European stuff. But ultimately, like, why am I doing that, right? It's because we've sort of like ignored the fact that this stuff even exists.
Right.
And so what I'm hoping to accomplish then, right, is to kind of bring the two into maybe some kind of greater degree of balance. So then we could genuinely talk about this idea of the inosculation, right? How are these two things actually merging? And so I kind of get into that like towards the end of this thing that I wrote, where, if you look at what somebody like Yogendra is doing, for instance, right? I mean, and he does quote Stebbins explicitly, and he clearly finds that there's something useful in terms of how he's thinking about yoga here.
Yeah.
But he's also very much thinking about yoga from an Indian perspective, right? And so when he publishes his manuals, as with Yogananda, you see this kind of fusion. Now, he does the fusion differently than Yogananda does, right? Their systems of practice don't look the same. But they're both these interesting combinations, right, of the stuff that they're sort of working with on the Indian side, and then what they're encountering and how they're sort of incorporating, right, and synthesizing. Yeah, so I mean, I think ultimately, right, like that's where I want to go with this, but David White actually said this at some point to me when I was studying with him at UCSB, right, because he makes a lot of these like really big claims that tend to kind of piss people off, because they're like, oh, well, you're saying, the Yoga Sutras aren't real yoga. David Gordon White. And so, at some point he was like, well, you know why I say the Yoga Sutras aren't real yoga? Because there's so many people out there saying like, oh, like the Yoga Sutras are the only real yoga, right? So his response is like, okay, I'm going to go to the opposite extreme, right? Let's see what happens when we completely discount the Yoga Sutras. Now, I mean, maybe I'm kind of misinterpreting him a little bit here, but I don't think he would actually say, right, like no, like this is like, even though people are calling it yoga for like millennia now almost, right? Like we just shouldn't talk about it. I think what he's trying to do is kind of right the balance a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to draw on that logic a little bit.
They still seem like very similar to me. I know we're saying that you feel like the goal is different between the two, but Yogananda talks about how the purpose of the energization exercises and then the meditation is to feel the presence of God in your body, physically, and that's this feeling of joy or ecstasy that comes with that. And to me, her saying that it's feeling your own soul, letting your soul express through your body, those seem like the same thing. It's like this idea of this cosmic energy, whether it's coming in through the medulla oblongata or coming in through the solar plexus of the heart. It's the same thing. It's the idea of connecting to this cosmic energy source through the physical body. So, but you have to still your mind first to do that. To quiet, I think so, yeah, because you have those anxieties, those human things, this and that, and that's what the asanas are all about, is quieting down enough to get to that point where you can feel whatever it is, either coming through your heart or coming through your medulla oblongata or your thigh or whatever.
Yeah, so I don't think I disagree with you. I mean, I think if we want to try to kind of get down to like what is like the experiential core of this, I think they might actually genuinely be very similar states of being. Right?
So is that yoga, wanting to feel this connection to the cosmic energy source in your body?
I mean, certainly people in Renaissance Europe that were doing this stuff wouldn't have called it yoga, right? They would have called it something else. They would have called it theurgy, for instance. So, I mean, we can choose to call it yoga, right? But I mean, I think to some extent we have to kind of recognize like why we want to do that, right? And are we doing it for all of these very complicated historical reasons? And are there maybe actually sort of some differences?
I also think that it's a slightly ironic conversation to have to try to put a label on it in the first place, right? I think that's probably, if there was this intermingling at that time in history between the two of them, how they might have played off of one another. One of them was clearly just looking for a label for what they were doing, right? And there's this appeal here that there's, we don't have this foundational, traditional way of orienting ourselves to our land or our ancestors in a way that other cultures did. So we're going to need to label whatever experience you're both talking about, because it's like this, it's such an internal experience that we have that why are we talking about what it should be called?
Well, the interesting thing about mystical states, right, is that usually people say they're kind of beyond language.
Exactly, yeah.
So yeah, ultimately, if that's what we care about, like, I mean, it doesn't really matter what we call it, right? Like,
I liked what you said though, because it brought it back to the basics, which sometimes I think I have to get back to, because I can go in like 700 directions at once. But you said yoga is the word to describe the practice and it's the goal. So it's like, it's just a label,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I still, and this is just my religious studies background, like I kind of, on the one hand, I'm very drawn to this idea of like the common like bodily like experience, right, of something like a mystical state of consciousness. But then I'm often kind of pulled back to, all of this sort of like the critical scholarship end of it that's like, well, right, like we can say like all paths up the mountain lead to the common goal, but what do we do with like the fact that these traditions actually don't talk about that goal in the same way, right? And some of them actually insist on radically different versions of like what we're aiming towards. Like, should we just sort of discount that and say like, well, like you're just kind of using like different language because of X, right? But really you're talking about the same thing.
And it's almost like we're entering into the quote-unquote yoga world in an opposite aspect as India did, where it was this essentially less physical, more spiritual, contemplative practice that morphed its way in time and history further into a physical practice, and then it comes to America, quote-unquote, or it's found in America and then labeled yoga, and we're starting physical, and hopefully we're moving back to less physical. I shouldn't say hopefully, but personally hopefully. Something greater.
Well, coming back around to the question of like, is it yoga? Like, is it in or is it out? And like so many times we've all talked about like, well, yoga has so many different definitions. It can mean union, it can mean yoking, it can also mean trick or fraud. And so from that standpoint, if we like allow these totally alternate, non-liberative forms to retain, the name, like, because if we're just doing it like to have a hot body or to do a handstand in the center of the room for our Instagram page or whatever, like then that's still yoga, because maybe like we're letting ourselves be tricked, or we're like sort of in on that fraud, I don't know.
Yeah, I find that an interesting idea. I mean, yeah, or yoga means chariot or something, right? Like,
Yeah, vehicle, like, we don't necessarily know what's the end point of the vehicle. That could be different for very different people, or as you pointed out, like, you know, some of us are doing it to still the whirlings of the mind, and some of us are doing it for very other, you know, reasons. Like, you know, whether or not I'm doing it to, you know, try and take over someone else's body, it's still a vehicle maybe, you know.
Mhm.
I'm not trying to take over.
Don't judge.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that actually. You can yoke yourself to all sorts of things, right?
Yeah, and we always say, like, right, oh, yoga is, you know, the postural practice is only one limb, you know, so, like, so how do we find space for all those other limbs to be yoga in an embodied way in the world? Like, you know, I don't know, the deeper I get into the study, the less I know how to answer when people say, what is yoga? So,
Me too.
Good.
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to just sort of give an example that some of the students will know about, some of the students might learn about. In the arena of Yogendra seeking out Stebbins, and there was an originator called Mahapragya, who was so widely read, who was just interested in all things. He was a monk, he had plenty of time on his hands, and he read this study of a prison experiment in San Bernardino. Okay, he's never left India. Reads about this study where they locked up people in different color cells and then registered their emotional response. And based on that research that he read, he developed a whole visualization of green and yellow and pink and white that now has become codified as the true yoga for Jains in India.
Is it Preksha?
Fascinating.
Yeah, and this is how Preksha works. And I remember, like, what? I'm supposed to see green? What? You know, and then learning about this history of sort of reception and really fascination with science, all in goodwill, but then having it infused with other practices that use colors differently.
Well, yeah, and this idea of, now I know, who was it, Kurt Leland, right, just wrote that book, The Rainbow Body, where he kind of goes through
Right.
like the Western history
Yeah.
of chakras were received. And he doesn't really go very much further back than the Theosophical Society in terms of like what is the actual Western context of this. But if you look at, so let's see if we can get back to it actually, so we have a visual here. Oops. So this stuff, why are there 7 colors to the rainbow, even though we know like indigo and blue are kind of the same thing? Because there are 7 planets. And if you look at who said there were 7 colors, which was Newton, by the way, so there's your science, right? Why does Newton say there are 7 colors? Specifically because there are 7 planets, and they're correlated with these sort of intervals on the musical scale. So there was just a book that came out about this recently, right? If you look at Newton's color wheel, it's colors, but it's also notes. And so there's all this interesting kind of history that actually sort of really overlaps the spiritual and the scientific side of it. It's the same in India too, right? So now we're talking about, like with the Ayur Yoga project, for instance, right? How like it would be really useful to look at Ayurveda, right? And see how that overlaps with like other types of yogic disciplines. And to a certain extent, once I started digging into this stuff on the European side, it became so obvious to me that of course it's this. If you're dealing with bodily practices, like what other framework do we have for interpreting the body, right? It's medicine. And so if you're, like, it's all just a kind of worldview into which the body falls, right? So in that sense, like, yes, obviously the medical and the spiritual are going to be kind of continuous. Like, alchemy might have religious ends, but it's also like protochemistry. It's actually a very like modern artificial thing that we separate these things out, right, and kind of treat them as completely different spheres that don't have anything to say to one another.
This is such a great chart.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. Well, there's and actually the even cooler image is, and I think this is in Leland's book. it's the drawing of the chakras, or at least the kind of European instantiation of the chakras in, I want to say it's Ledbetter's book, actually. And so he plucks out something that's sort of like this, but it's actually even more evocative because it's coming from Christian Theosophy. It's not the Theosophical Society, older stuff. And so it has a sort of a human body, but it's actually got these little kind of circles, right, where you would locate these sort of intersections of the spheres with the various parts of the torso. And so, I mean, like, it's literally, it circles on the torso, right? It looks so much like chakras. And so Ledbetter's like, whoa, look, here's chakras. But if you look at where this image is actually coming from, it has nothing to do with anything that the chakras have ever meant in, like, Indian culture. But it's so easy to look at it, right, and just be like, oh, well, yes, obviously these are the same thing. And so, yeah, there's just so many instances in which that happens. Fascinating.
For the school that you said that Genevieve went to in France, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was also school, and Delsart had sort of, he was at the conservatory in Paris for a long time, and so that's kind of largely where he continued to work out of. And he had a number of students that kind of carried on his teachings. He actually, like Ling, never really published anything on his own. But there's one of his students publishes his notes, essentially, kind of subsequently to this. So Stebbins goes and she like hangs out with that student for a number of years.
And, okay, so she wasn't around the same time period as he was founding it?
No, so she never met Delsart himself.
Okay.
She primarily worked with direct students of Delsart. Yeah, and actually, you know, if you want to kind of talk like authentic, unauthentic, Delsart's daughter comes to the U.S. in the boom of this sort of what we call American Delsartism, and she takes a look at it and she's like, you know what? Like, none of this is what my father taught, right? You keep slapping the name Delsart on it, like, this is like inauthentic Delsart, right? It's fake. Everything you're doing is fake. And interestingly, right? They listen to her and they're like, okay, fine. Right? Like Delsart might have not like foreseen these uses, but we're not doing Delsart, we're doing American Delsartism. Right? And so like, okay, Delsart didn't do it, but we are, because obviously this is the logical thing you would do with this body of knowledge.
It's the same thing we're talking about with yoga and how it's come here and what it is, right? It's the same, you start it one way and if it's pictured or if it's supposed to be, you know, inch this way or inch that way, and then it moves and time takes it and then it's just something else.
Yeah, practices change, right? Ideas change.
Pilates.
And to me, like that's really not an issue. Like that's what makes it all cool. Where it becomes tricky, right, is when, of course, you have all these various power imbalances, right? And you have colonialism and you have imperialism, right? All that stuff, and like cultural appropriation, right? I mean, I do this with my students, right? Because they get like really into like, okay, but like, am I culturally appropriating when I listen to rap music or something like that? And I give them the dictionary definition of cultural appropriation. I'm like, look, it literally just means like exchange between cultures, but which is like how all of human history works, right? Like that's just like what happens. But when does it become a problem, right? One instance where it becomes a problem is where there's these unequal power dynamics. And so to the extent that that's often true in the yoga world in various ways, right? Then I have a little bit more sympathy for these arguments about like, okay, well, like how are we using this term, right? And what's the history of how we're using this term? Because you look back at the 1930s and you have, you know, European authors that are making the argument of like, well, you know, yoga is your Aryan birthright. Yeah, and like that's like Nazi language, right? And so like we don't want to do that. And I don't think most yoga practitioners are doing that. But it's a very, very thin line, right? Like it's shocking how quickly you get into these positions of just kind of overt white supremacy. And so I think for those reasons, like it pays to be cognizant, at least, right, of how we're using these concepts and how we're using these terminology. But at the same time, like, yeah, it's a bodily practice, and like yoga's just a word, and like probably you're not gonna sit down until I mean, how many million is it now, like Americans that are doing yoga, right? Like, I mean, you can't put out a bulletin and be like, okay, like, look at what you're doing and figure out, right? Does it check these boxes? Like, if so, you can call it yoga. If not, like, you're out of luck, but like, let's call it something else, right? Like, that's not gonna happen.
Sorry, Morgan, it's not gonna happen.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.